Lanhee, you were involved in Mitt Romney's 2012 campaign. Building on what Ross was saying about the similarities between the rise of Donald Trump in 2016 and Bernie Sanders, what has changed since then? And how do you see the role of decadence, like Ross is describing, in that?
Well, look, I think what's changed is we've had, several intervening years of Donald Trump. And I think for the Democratic Party, I agree completely with what Ross is saying in the sense that the Democratic Party as a party vehicle is pretty meaningless. What you have is a bunch of people and some institutions that don't necessarily have a lot of power anymore. But I do think there's a motivation amongst Democrats, a very strong motivation, that is, to ensure that they find a way to come together and beat Donald Trump. So in that sense, I think that the kind of skepticism that you still saw around Donald Trump, even lingering into the spring and summer of 2016, I think if Bernie Sanders becomes the presumptive nominee, a lot of that's going to melt away much more quickly, precisely because of the intervening last couple of years and the motivation that a lot of Democrats feel to beat Donald Trump. So I do think that change is important, but I absolutely think the dynamic at play here, what's fueling Sanders, how he's able to get out there and paint in very bold strokes, whether you like it or not, I think that bears a lot of similarity, and in fact, a lot of the appeal of Bernie Sanders comes from that.
So, Yamiche, we're talking big, important political themes here. Let's get more specific about where you are tonight. You're in Charleston, South Carolina, the site of that debate tonight. Joe Biden has long been the leader in the state of South Carolina. He has implored people to be patient with him, to get him to South Carolina, a state he knows he has to win. But Bernie Sanders has crept up and nearly tied him in some of the polling there. What do you expect to see tonight?
What I expect to see tonight is a Democratic field that's going to be laser focused on trying to get Bernie Sanders to make a mistake or to say something that's going to hurt his momentum going into Super Tuesday, going into this South Carolina primary. I've been talking to people all week here, and what I see are several different divides. There's the generational divide, of course, that we've talked about, with Bernie Sanders leading mostly among 18 to 29-year-olds who think that their lives need a radical change and that their revolution and that the revolution that Bernie Sanders is talking about includes a lot of things that black and brown people, young black and brown people here in South Carolina, where black voters make up the majority of the vote, that their lives need to be changed by that. Then I talk to people who also are older who say, I like Joe Biden because he's a statesman. I like Joe Biden because he's someone who calls former President Barack Obama my friend Barack. That being said, apart from the generational divide, what I've picked up on is a divide among people who want to see a fighter. There are people who used to support Joe Biden who tell me, I haven't seen him get in the mud. I haven't seen him really defend his family. And that's made me question whether or not Joe Biden's up for this fight. And then they see someone like Bernie Sanders and they say, look, this is someone who, even if I don't agree with all his policies, he's someone who seems like he's going to be able to put up a fight with President Trump. And that's why we're seeing that. And of course, Tom Steyer, the billionaire, has spent millions here. And that's meant that he's been able to take some of the support from Joe Biden. So we're also going to see Tom Steyer trying to go after Bernie Sanders, trying to make his case that he is someone who can be an alternative to Joe Biden, who's seeming as though he will likely win the primary here, but it will be by a narrow margin. It won't be by the big margin we saw Bernie Sanders win in Nevada.
Lanhee, you've had a lot of practice at this level of politics, dealing with Governor Romney and debate prep and everything like that. What's your perspective, your thoughts on one candidate tonight who has to take out her opponent right in front of her? That would be Elizabeth Warren, and her opponent, Bernie Sanders, and yet the odds are she'll go after Mike Bloomberg, who's not even on the ballot.
Yeah, I mean, this to me has been a really interesting dynamic, because usually it's the case that when you have two people who ideologically seem relatively similar, you've got to figure out a way to draw distinction. You've got to figure out a way to go on the attack. And we just haven't seen that. We've seen, if anything, Warren's been kind of a shill for Sanders, which suggests maybe she thinks she's a vice presidential possibility for Sanders. Maybe she wants to stay in his good graces. But it makes absolutely no sense for her to be going after Michael Bloomberg, who I don't think occupies any similar space. And I don't think in this race is where she needs to be. And so I'm puzzled by the fact that we haven't seen her go after Bernie more. And I don't think we're going to see it tonight either. None of the signaling we're getting from her campaign suggests she's going to do that. But conventional debate tactics would be, you got to go after the front runner, certainly if that front runner is occupying some of the same ideological space as you are.
Yeah, and that is curious, that she has not gone after Bernie. And like you, Lonnie, I don't suspect she will do that again tonight. So Ross, I was just thinking while we were all talking about some tweets I saw yesterday or the day before, and it had to do with how things actually, even in these chaotic days and these polarized days for at least the political class, how things are getting better, how abortion rates continue to decline and have for a very long time, how crime has been declining over the past 10, 15 years, how teenage pregnancies declining. I mean, there are, of course, world poverty at an all-time low. There are, if you could just get rid of the entire political class, and then a lot of people would say,
Bernie and Trump are working on that.
And of course, cable news and talk radio and the internet. A lot of people would say, these really are the best of times. So when you talk about decadence, again, it's not even societal, is it? Is it more political? I mean, the political, so decadent, when I talk about decadence, the part that everybody recognizes is Washington, D.C., right? Gridlock, stalemate, everyone agrees D.C. is decadent. But the indicators you're talking about are a good example of what I mean, right? 30 years ago, teenage behavior was a lot worse than it is today in many ways. People were more likely to drive drunk, they were more likely to have sex early, they were more likely to get pregnant, and so on. Today, teens are better behaved than ever, but they're more likely to be depressed, more likely to commit suicide, and more likely to spend their lives on their phones and playing video games. And that's sort of the trade-off of decadence. Decadence is a safer thing. It's more stable. Your kids are less likely to, go down by the reservoir and get drunk and jump into the reservoir under decadence, right? They're more likely to be in their rooms tapping away on their little screens, talking to their friends. And there are worse things than that. Right.
But there's also better things, I think, than a world where people are sort of retreating into the virtual. And that's I think, the big story of the Western world. It's sort of, that's where our technological progress is. It's all in virtual realities, and we're retreating into them, becoming safer, but maybe not becoming happier.
I still remember it had to be 20 years ago or so. It was the 30th anniversary of Rolling Stone, and Tom Wolfe wrote an essay, and he said, "It's not lost on me that the most affluent generation in the history of mankind is also the most medicated," which really seems to line up with your thesis, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in an age of people taking drugs, legal and illegal, that are numbing, right? It's not the age of the crack epidemic and cocaine and people taking drugs that make them more likely to be violent, but maybe also more likely to be creative. It's the age of opioids and marijuana and people taking drugs that sort of numb pain and let them slip away. And again, that stabilizes things. America is, for all of what's on Twitter and all of what's on cable news, it's definitely a more stable country than it was when we were going to the moon in 1969 and everything was in chaos. But it's also a less dynamic and more, I think, decadent society than it was when we made that leap.
All right, the new book is The Decadent Society, How We Became Victims of Our Own Success. Ross Douthat, thank you so much. Lonnie Chen, thank you as well. We love having you on the show. And thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube. And make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.